A kingdom doesn't collapse when truth disappears. It collapses when people stop recognizing the difference between truth and approval. That's the uncomfortable paradox at the center of King Lear. And it raises a question most interpretations never fully answer. Why does a ruler, someone who controls land, armies, and legacy, become completely blind the moment he is praised? Because this isn't just a story about a king. It's a study of a psychological system where validation slowly replaces perception. When Lear asks his daughters to declare their love for him, he is not seeking information. He is seeking confirmation. Not reality, but reinforcement. And that shift seems small, until you realize it changes what he is even capable of seeing. In that moment, truth stops being a signal. It becomes a threat. And here's the first rupture in perception: contradiction emerges where loyalty becomes performance. The more theatrical the praise, the more true it appears to him. The quieter voice, Cordelia's refusal to exaggerate, feels like absence. Like disrespect. Like danger. But absence of performance is not absence of truth. This is where the system begins to fracture. Because in the Lear dynamic, influence does not belong to the honest, it belongs to the convincing. And convincing is not about accuracy. It's about emotional resonance. About what feels safe to believe. So the question shifts: if truth and persuasion diverge, which one survives inside a system built on hierarchy? Revelation begins to surface here. Authority does not sharpen perception, it filters it. It selects for voices that reinforce identity. And quietly eliminates the ones that don't. In psychological terms, this is not just ego. It is structural blindness. A ruler surrounded by agreement slowly loses access to contradiction. And without contradiction, judgment doesn't become stronger, it becomes isolated. Think about that mechanism outside the play. In modern systems, in leadership rooms, in digital spaces where feedback is curated and approval is optimized. The same pattern repeats. Not because people are irrational, but because reinforcement is easier to tolerate than disruption. And Lear becomes a memory fragment of this pattern, a man sitting at the center of absolute authority, yet progressively disconnected from reality. Not because truth wasn't present, but because truth was not rewarded. Memory fragment, a crown that represents authority, but also filters perception, gold that does not reflect reality, only admiration. As this blindness deepens, consequence starts to take shape before any external collapse occurs. Decisions begin to drift. Signals become distorted. Honest voices disappear from the system, not by force, but by neglect. And here is the scale shift: this is no longer about a father and his daughters. It becomes a model of how any closed feedback loop eventually confuses emotional comfort with strategic clarity. So the unsettling insight is this: Lear does not lose his kingdom because he lacks power. He loses it because power changed what he was allowed to perceive. And that leads to a final, unresolved tension. If authority naturally filters reality toward comfort, then what does it mean for truth to survive inside systems that reward approval over accuracy? Or more disturbing still, how many decisions we call rational are already shaped by voices we chose because they made us feel right, not because they were right? And if that is true, then the real question is no longer about King Lear at all. It becomes something larger, and harder to escape. What do we actually see when we think we are seeing the truth, and who trained our perception to trust it? The deeper question is not why truth is ignored, but why systems consistently evolve to make truth inconvenient. Because once perception becomes tied to approval, something subtle begins to happen inside any structure of power. Signals stop competing on accuracy, and start competing on emotional efficiency. The fastest way to be understood is no longer to be correct, it is to be agreeable. So what actually governs decision-making inside such a system? We are not looking at a moral failure. We are looking at a selection mechanism. Context shifts here. Contradiction emerges as loyalty becomes noise filtering rather than truth filtering. In Lear's world, the voices closest to power are not the most accurate, they are the most adaptive. They learn what the system rewards. They calibrate language, tone, intensity. Not to reflect reality, but to survive attention. And this is where influence quietly changes form. Cordelia represents something structurally unstable in this environment. Not because she lacks loyalty, but because she refuses translation. She does not convert truth into performance. She does not optimize her message for emotional acceptance. And in a system driven by validation, that is indistinguishable from rejection. Revelation appears as a structural law. Truth without adaptation becomes invisible inside systems optimized for affirmation. And once something becomes invisible, it stops being part of decision-making reality. Lear's perception does not break suddenly. It narrows gradually, like a camera lens tightening around only what produces emotional confirmation. Every interaction reinforces the same filter: louder praise equals clearer signal, quieter honesty equals uncertainty. But here is the escalation most interpretations miss. This is not just psychological blindness. It becomes environmental. Because once a leader begins rewarding affirmation over accuracy, the entire surrounding structure adapts. People don't just lie, they refine the art of believable distortion. The system evolves its own language of survival. Memory fragment, a throne room filled not with deception, but with perfectly optimized sincerity, statements designed not to mislead, but to be believed. That distinction is critical. Because in such environments, truth is not attacked directly. It is slowly replaced by something more efficient: alignment with expectation. And this is where consequence becomes irreversible before collapse is even visible. Strategic signals degrade. Risk is misread. Early warnings are dismissed not because they are hidden, but because they feel emotionally incompatible with the leader's internal model of reality. So the system continues forward, confident, reinforced, and increasingly disconnected from external feedback. Scale shift: what begins as a family conflict reveals itself as a universal mechanism of authority. Any hierarchy that rewards emotional agreement begins to drift away from environmental truth. And yet the most disturbing layer remains unresolved. If systems naturally evolve toward rewarding what feels coherent rather than what is accurate, then blindness is not an accident. It is a byproduct of stability. Which leads to a sharper, more uncomfortable tension: is clarity something systems can actually sustain, or does every structure of power eventually optimize itself toward selective blindness in order to preserve internal harmony? And if that is the case, then the real mystery is no longer about one ruler's misjudgment. It becomes something far more unsettling. What would a system look like if it rewarded truth even when truth destabilized it, and why does that version of reality feel almost impossible to maintain? The most unsettling part is not that systems drift toward distortion, but that they often do so while believing they are becoming more stable. So the question now is no longer about perception alone. It becomes about structure itself. What kind of system quietly rewards agreement so efficiently that disagreement begins to feel like instability? Because once that threshold is crossed, something irreversible happens inside any hierarchy. Not a collapse, but a refinement. The system starts selecting for signals that reduce friction, not signals that increase accuracy. And that is where reality begins to thin. In Lear's world, this shift is no longer theoretical. It becomes operational. Every voice around authority is filtered through a silent expectation: does this strengthen cohesion or introduce uncertainty? Deep context emerges here. Contradiction is no longer just tolerated or rejected. It is reclassified as emotional noise. And once contradiction is reclassified, it is no longer processed as information. It is dismissed before interpretation even begins. This is where escalation begins to accelerate. Because the system is now optimizing for coherence rather than truth, the most adaptive voices are not those closest to reality, but those closest to expectation. Language itself begins to evolve under pressure. Statements become shaped less by observation and more by anticipated reception. Revelation surfaces as a structural inversion. What survives inside authority is not what is most true, but what is most compatible with the authority's emotional model of reality. And this is where influence changes character entirely. Cordelia's refusal to exaggerate is not simply misinterpreted. it becomes structurally incompatible. Not because it is incorrect, but because it introduces friction into a system designed to minimize it. That friction is experienced not as honesty, but as disruption. Memory fragment, a royal court where silence from one voice carries more weight than the spoken praise of many, because silence cannot be processed, only interpreted. And interpretation inside a filtered system is dangerous. It fills gaps with assumption. It converts absence into narrative. It transforms restraint into threat. Now consequence expands beyond individual misjudgment. This is no longer about one decision or one moment of blindness. It becomes about systemic feedback collapse. When signals are shaped by expectation, the system loses its ability to distinguish environment from reflection. What arrives is not warning, but echo. And echoes feel like confirmation. Scale shift intensifies. This mechanism is not limited to leadership or family structures. It appears wherever feedback is mediated by approval. Any environment that rewards alignment over friction begins to replace external reality with internal reinforcement loops. At that point, correction becomes structurally impossible without rupture. Because there is no longer a stable reference point outside the system. Everything has been translated through the same filter. And yet the most dangerous layer is still ahead. If contradiction is automatically softened, and truth is only accepted when it aligns with expectation, then the system does not just become blind. It begins to become self-referential. It starts to believe its own echo. Which leads to a deeper rupture forming beneath the surface. If every signal is filtered for coherence, then what happens when reality finally refuses to cooperate with the model that has been built to interpret it? Is the collapse that follows an accident of misjudgment, or the inevitable result of a system that can no longer recognize anything that challenges its own reflection? The most difficult realization is not that systems misinterpret truth, but that they actively reshape it into something they can tolerate. So the question now shifts again. If feedback loops consistently compress reality into comfort, then what exactly is being optimized inside authority structures? And what gets quietly removed in the process? Because at this stage, distortion is no longer visible as error. It becomes indistinguishable from normal communication. And that is where revelation begins to surface. What Lear unknowingly creates is not simply a family conflict or a political miscalculation. He constructs a closed interpretive system where emotional reinforcement replaces external validation. Inside that system, every signal is evaluated not by its accuracy, but by its emotional compatibility with authority. Revelation, perception inside power does not expand reality, it selects from it. This selection process is subtle. It does not erase truth directly. It filters it through layers of acceptability until only what feels coherent remains. Over time, the system stops interacting with reality itself and begins interacting with a curated reflection of it. And that is where the core conflict fully crystallizes. Not truth versus lies, but truth versus survivability inside the system. Because in such an environment, truth is not rejected for being false. It is rejected for being destabilizing. Memory fragment, a sealed hall where every voice echoes back slightly altered, until no speaker can recognize their own original intent. This is not metaphorical. It is structural. Once reinforcement becomes the dominant selection mechanism, every participant unconsciously adapts to it. Even silence begins to take on strategic meaning. Even hesitation becomes interpreted as alignment or resistance. And this is where deep consequence emerges. Lear's authority does not collapse because it is attacked from outside. It collapses because the internal model of reality becomes too consistent with itself. External contradiction no longer has a place to land. It either gets absorbed into the system or excluded before recognition. At that point, decision-making loses contact with correction. Scale shift, this is no longer about one ruler or one kingdom. It is a model for any environment where feedback is filtered through emotional stability rather than informational accuracy. Institutions, leadership structures, even cultural systems begin to exhibit the same drift when reinforcement becomes more important than contradiction. And what makes this even more unstable is that from the inside, the system does not feel blind. It feels coherent. It feels increasingly certain. That certainty is the most dangerous signal of all, because it replaces doubt with alignment, and alignment with perceived truth. So the deeper implication begins to surface here. If systems naturally evolve toward coherence, even at the cost of accuracy, then blindness is not an anomaly. It is a byproduct of stability itself. And now the question transforms again, into something sharper, more unsettling, and harder to resolve. If every system that rewards internal harmony eventually detaches from external reality, then is collapse an error in judgment, or is it the moment when reality finally reasserts itself against a structure that has stopped recognizing it? The deepest rupture inside any system is not when truth is denied, but when the system no longer has a mechanism to recognize what truth even feels like. So the question now becomes unavoidable. If authority filters every signal through emotional compatibility, what remains of judgment itself? And what happens when decision-making is no longer anchored in reality, but in internal coherence? Because at that point, something fundamental has already changed. Not the loss of truth, but the replacement of its function. Core revelation emerges here. Truth is not destroyed inside power structures. It is repurposed. It stops acting as a guiding force and becomes an optional input, evaluated only when it aligns with internal stability. This is the hidden architecture beneath Lear's collapse. Not a failure of intelligence, but a transformation of purpose. Information is no longer used to understand the world. It is used to preserve emotional equilibrium within authority. And once that shift occurs, every layer beneath it reorganizes. Cordelia's role is no longer simply that of truth-teller. She becomes a structural anomaly. Not because she challenges power, but because she introduces data that cannot be absorbed without altering the system itself. Her presence exposes the limitation of a model that only accepts reinforcement-compatible reality. Memory fragment, a single unfiltered voice in a chamber designed for echoes, where silence becomes louder than speech because it cannot be translated. This is where the insight deepens beyond individual psychology. The conflict is not between honesty and deception. It is between two incompatible operating systems, one that prioritizes environmental alignment, and one that prioritizes internal stability. And when those two systems collide, stability almost always wins in the short term. But it wins by narrowing perception. Over time, this creates a paradoxical consequence. The more stable the internal system becomes, the less capable it is of adapting to external change. Not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks unfiltered input. Lear's authority does not simply misjudge reality. It gradually replaces reality with a version that can be emotionally sustained. And that replacement is invisible from within. Because coherence feels like clarity. Scale shift, this is not just a story about a fragmented royal household. It becomes a blueprint for how any closed authority system evolves when feedback is continuously shaped to avoid disruption. Institutions, organizations, even cultural belief systems can drift into this same pattern without recognizing it. What begins as a desire for harmony slowly becomes a mechanism for exclusion. Not exclusion of people, but exclusion of dissonant information. And once dissonant information is consistently removed, the system begins to believe it is perfectly aligned with reality. That belief is the final stage before collapse. Memory fragment, a golden crown not as a symbol of power, but as a filter that determines which truths are allowed to exist in the same space as authority. And here lies the deeper philosophical realization. If every system that prioritizes emotional stability over informational friction eventually loses contact with external reality, then collapse is not a sudden failure. It is the moment when excluded reality accumulates to a point that can no longer be ignored. So the question is no longer whether the system will break. The question is what kind of truth has been waiting outside the system long enough to force its way back in, and what happens when it finally does. What remains after a system can no longer recognize external truth is not immediate collapse, but delayed distortion. A slow unraveling where decisions still look rational on the surface, yet gradually lose contact with anything outside themselves. So the question now is not what caused the failure, but what continues to exist after the failure has already been structurally encoded into the system. Because once truth has been reclassified as something optional, consequences no longer arrive as warnings. They arrive as outcomes that feel unexpected only from the inside. And that is where the legacy of this structure begins to reveal itself. Consequence emerges not as a single event, but as accumulation. Each ignored contradiction does not disappear. It remains embedded, quietly shaping future interpretations. Over time, what was once dismissed as discomfort becomes the foundation of irreversible direction. The system does not fall because of one mistake. It falls because every correction was interpreted as instability. Memory fragment, a silent hall where every removed voice leaves no absence, only a growing inability to distinguish signal from background. This is the lingering effect of Lear's structure. Not just the loss of judgment, but the inheritance of a broken method of judgment. A way of seeing the world that rewards alignment over accuracy continues to operate even after the moment of crisis has passed. And this is where expansion becomes visible beyond the individual. Because once this pattern is established, it does not remain contained. It becomes replicable. Anyone operating inside the same logic of reinforcement begins to inherit the same limitation, the gradual replacement of external feedback with internal confirmation loops. What survives is not the event itself, but the logic that produced it. Scale shift, this is how systems outlive their failures. Not by correcting them, but by normalizing the conditions that created them in the first place. The structure remains intact even when its understanding of reality has already decayed. And that is the deeper legacy at play here. Lear is not remembered simply as a figure who misjudged loyalty. He becomes a symbol of how authority, when insulated from contradiction, begins to generate its own version of truth. A truth that is internally consistent, emotionally stable, and externally fragile. And that fragility is often only visible in retrospect. Memory fragment, a crown that survives the ruler, but carries forward the exact same distortion in perception, passed down as tradition rather than recognized as error. This is the most unsettling aspect of legacy in this system. It does not end with collapse. It continues as interpretation. Future observers reconstruct meaning from fragments already shaped by distortion, unknowingly extending the original bias into new contexts. So what appears as history is often just the continuation of a filtered narrative. And that raises a reflection that extends far beyond the boundaries of the story itself. If systems do not correct distortion but instead preserve it through interpretation, then every inherited lesson may already be shaped by the same blind spots that created the failure in the first place. Which leads to a more difficult realization. Perhaps the most powerful influence any system leaves behind is not its success or its collapse, but the invisible rules it normalizes about what can be seen, what can be said, and what must remain unchallenged. So the question becomes unavoidable: if every legacy carries with it a hidden structure of perception, then how much of what is considered wisdom is actually just inherited blindness that has never been re-examined? What remains after a system learns to trust its own echo more than the world outside it is not collapse in a single moment, but a quiet transformation of meaning itself. Because by the time distortion becomes visible, it is already too late to recognize it as distortion. It has already been absorbed into what feels normal, reasonable, even necessary. And so the final question is not about what was lost, but what was never designed to be preserved in the first place. Final insight emerges here: the deepest failure inside any authority structure is not misjudgment, but the gradual replacement of reality with interpretations that feel emotionally sustainable. At that point, truth is no longer something the system seeks. It becomes something the system must filter in order to function. And that is why this story does not end as a tragedy of one individual, but as a mirror of a repeating pattern. Memory fragment, a crown resting on an empty throne, not as a symbol of power, but as evidence that power once required contact with something outside itself to remain intact. What survives after Lear is not resolution. It is recognition. A recognition that systems built on validation inevitably begin to lose their ability to distinguish between what is real and what is reassuring. And that recognition extends far beyond the boundaries of the narrative. Because in modern life, the same mechanism quietly reappears in different forms. In leadership, in culture, in personal identity. Anywhere feedback is shaped to maintain comfort rather than challenge assumption. The legacy is not the fall. The legacy is the pattern that continues after the fall has been forgotten. And perhaps the most human part of this entire structure is not the blindness itself, but the fact that it always begins with something deeply familiar, the desire to be seen in a way that feels acceptable. Memory fragment, a voice offering truth, not rejected because it is false, but because it disrupts the image a system has learned to protect. In the end, what lingers is not the collapse of a kingdom, but the realization that perception is never neutral. It is shaped, filtered, and reinforced by what we choose to tolerate in order to maintain stability. And if that is true, then the boundary between clarity and illusion is not fixed. It is negotiated continuously, every time we decide whether to accept what is true or what is easier to believe. So the final question is not about the past, or even about the story itself. It is about the quiet mechanisms still operating within every system of thought, every structure of authority, every moment of personal certainty. If perception is always shaped by what we are willing to hear, then what truths are already standing in front of us right now, waiting not to be discovered, but simply to be heard without resistance?